The American Civil War was a brutal and bloody match between families, Americans against Americans. The most destructive war in American history was rooted in the debate over slavery and its role in the United States. Fighting would rage across the country as the Union Army faced off against the newly seceded Confederacy. The Union's goal? To reunite the country, while the Confederacy's goal to remain on its own and separate. One of the biggest advantages the Union Army possessed over the Confederacy was the influx of former slaves escaping into the North, many of which wanted nothing more than to fight for their kinsmen and to prove to all that they were equal in all ways to the white man. Following President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, African Americans were allowed to join the Union Army and Navy. But even in the free North, they had to deal with racism, as they were paid drastically less than their white counterparts, and also were only permitted for manual labor and not to become combative troops. But with persistence and the support of some high-ranking officers, black soldiers would begin to see small parts of conflict, and due to this, they would experience one of the most important moments for African Americans during the early summer months, during and at the Battle of Milliken's Bend. During the early part of the American Civil War, the Union's military strategy would be known as the Anaconda Plan. Designed by General Winfield Scott, the plan called for a massive naval blockade along the coast of the South and a highly aggressive assault up the Mississippi, which would effectively cut the South in half. One of the most important targets necessary for the success of the plan was that of the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, which was one of the last places the Union needed to capture to take control of the full Mississippi. The Vicksburg campaign was led by Union General Ulysses S. Grant, and his 47-day campaign would propel him to the front of the Union Army. After launching a siege on Vicksburg, Confederate leadership knew it was vital for them to alleviate some of the pressure that was on it. Southern General Richard Taylor would order John Walker's Texas Division of around 5,000 cavalrymen to launch a counter-assault on Northern forces in Madison Parish, Louisiana. That location would include Milliken's Bend, where Grant's forces had previously established a supply depot and a supply line. General Taylor and his Texas Division would reach Richmond on the 5th and 6th of June, 1863, and from there, Taylor would begin to gather information on the happenings at Milliken's Bend. Much of the information he gathered was inaccurate. This included the total number of soldiers stationed there. But something he did learn from this was that the majority of people there were black soldiers. See, Milliken's Bend wasn't a primary supply depot for Grant's army anymore. Rather, it was turned into training grounds for newly recruited African American soldiers, many of who had just escaped from the South. It contained the all-black 8th, 9th, 11th, and 13th Louisiana Infantry Regiments and the 1st Mississippi Infantry Regiment, and was led by Colonel Herman Leb, a white officer who had immigrated to America from Switzerland. Leb, learning of the increased presence of Confederate soldiers near Richmond, decided to scout the area with a small contingent of men in the early hours of June 6th, where, 3 miles outside of Richmond, he would be engaged by Confederate forces. Retreating back to Milliken's Bend, Leb recognized the dire situation he and his poorly trained men were in. Requesting immediate reinforcements, the 23rd Iowa All-White Regiment of about 125 men will be sent to assist him, as well as the ironclad Choctaw warship. All in all, at the Bend, Leb was in command of around 1,063 total men, with the only well-trained ones being the 125 from the 23rd Iowa Regiment. Spending the rest of the night of June 6th, Leb would have his men construct barricades of cotton bales along several levees to fortify their position against the coming force. But, sadly, it wouldn't be enough. Back in Richmond, knowing that they had been found out, the Texas Division was ordered to immediately attack once night fell. At 6 p.m. on June 6th, they left Richmond and began their march towards their target. At the Oak Grove plantation, the Texas Division broke into 3 separate brigades to attack different targets along the Mississippi. Brigadier General Henry McCulloch and his troop of 1,500 men were ordered to attack the Bend. Between 2:30 and 3 in the morning, McCulloch reached his target when he was immediately fired upon by a small forward unit, warning the rest of the Union Army that the Confederates had arrived. Quickly falling back, Lebb's men take up their positions behind the fortified levee and wait. McCulloch quickly reformed his ranks and ordered his men to charge the levee. As they make their charge, they quickly come under fire from the Union's first volley of bullets, but the poorly trained black soldiers were quickly overtaken by the charging Confederates before they could even reload for a second shot. Quickly, the brutal fighting turned to hand-to-hand combat, where bayonets and clubbed muskets turned the ground bloody. With this sudden onslaught, most of the well-trained white soldiers turned and quickly fled towards a second levee, but Lebb's African-American troops stood their ground, trying to hold off McCulloch's charge. McCulloch himself said after the battle, quote, "This charge was resisted by the Negro portion of the enemy's force with considerable obstinacy, while the white or true Yankee portion ran like whipped curs almost as soon as the charge was ordered." End quote. Continuing their charge, McCulloch attempted to take the second levee and push the Union troops into the river. But just when it looked to be all over for the North, the Choctaws sailed into view and unleashed a barrage of artillery that forced McCulloch's forces back behind the first levee. Countless attempts to take the second levee will be repelled by artillery strikes, and while waiting for reinforcements from the other Texas brigades to support him, McCulloch spotted a second warship, the Lexington, sailing towards their position. Realizing that now his forces were at a disadvantage, he decided in the early morning hours of the 7th of June to order his troops to withdraw back to the Oak Grove plantation. This brutal few hours of fighting took a heavy toll on both sides of the fight, with the Confederate Army resulting in 44 deaths and around another 140 either injured or missing. The untrained Union Army had around 101 killed, with another 551 injured or missing and taken prisoner, with the majority of them being black casualties. Following the battle, rumors would swirl around that the Confederates were treating the prisoners of war by either executing the black soldiers and the white officers or returning the former slaves back to the plantations. Even though they experienced massive losses at Milliken's Bend, it was viewed as a victory for both the Union's Vicksburg campaign, but more importantly, as a victory for African Americans. The assumption many white people had that black soldiers would lack courage and discipline was quickly dispelled by them standing against the onslaught of Confederate soldiers as their countrymen turned and fled. The Union finally recognized the military capabilities and courage of the former slaves and would use the legend of Milliken's Bend as a rally cry for other African Americans to join the army and help the Union defeat the Confederacy. And with that, they could begin to look forward for the chance to see themselves be recognized as equal to all. Throughout America's history, people always want to push the idea that African Americans are weaker in the mind, body, and soul of white people. But here at Milliken's Bend, and many times throughout history, they have proven that they aren't weak. On the contrary, many times they are stronger than many others due to their trauma and experiences that they've had to live through their entire lives.